He went from prison cells to sold-out arenas. He found love when nobody believed in him. She stood by him through the darkest chapters of his life. But after years of building something real together, Jelly Roll made a decision that shocked everyone who watched their love story unfold. In a raw moment of honesty, he finally revealed why his marriage to Bunnie XO couldn't survive. And the reason isn't what anyone expected. Jelly Roll wasn't supposed to make it past 30. By the time he was a teenager, he was already deep in Nashville's drug trade. He sold pills. He sold heroin. He watched friends die. He went to prison twice. The second time he thought that was it, that his life would end behind bars or on a street corner with a needle in his arm. But something shifted. He got out. He started making music. Real music. The kind that made people listen because every word came from a place of actual pain, actual survival. His albums climbed the charts. His concerts sold out. He won a Grammy. The kid that everyone wrote off as a statistic became one of the biggest names in hip-hop. Then he met Bunnie XO. She was a podcast host, a businesswoman, someone with her own platform and her own life. She didn't need Jelly Roll. That's probably why he needed her so badly. She saw him not as a rapper or a reformed criminal, but as a human being trying to become something different. They got married in 2022. For years, it looked like the ultimate redemption story, the man from the bottom finding real love with someone who believed in him. But here's what nobody understood. Changing on the outside and changing on the inside are two completely different things. You can sell out arenas and still be broken. You can win Grammys and still carry the weight of everything you've done. You can have someone love you and still not know how to love yourself back the way they deserve. Jelly Roll was living two different lives, and nobody realized how much energy that was taking from him. Before Bunnie, Jelly Roll had relationships. He had women who cared about him. But those connections were built on the version of him that was still partly lost. Still using, still running, still self-destructing. Bunnie was different because she arrived after he'd already started climbing out of the darkness. She didn't fall in love with a reformed version of a criminal. She fell in love with a man who was actively choosing to be better every single day. That kind of love changes something in you. He started talking about her differently in interviews. He credited her with saving his life. He'd say things like, "She saw something in me I couldn't see in myself." Bunnie was his mirror. She reflected back a version of himself that was worth fighting for. When you've spent your entire life believing you're disposable, that kind of reflection is life-altering. They got married. The wedding was huge. Social media exploded. Their fans celebrated them as proof that redemption was real, that love could heal even the deepest wounds. Bunnie posted about him constantly. Jelly Roll talked about how she changed his life. On the surface it looked perfect. But marriage is different than dating. Marriage means seeing someone every single day. It means dealing with their habits, their moods, their fears at 3 in the morning when the romantic part has worn off. It means compromise when you're exhausted. It means being vulnerable when you'd rather put on armor. For someone like Jelly Roll, someone who spent decades building walls as a survival mechanism, that level of exposure was terrifying in ways he didn't fully understand at first. Bunnie had given him unconditional love. But he was starting to realize that unconditional love, when you're still carrying trauma, can feel suffocating instead of saving. That's when the cracks started to show. From the outside, everything looked fine. Jelly Roll was touring. His music was thriving. He and Bunnie posted together. They seemed happy. But behind closed doors something was shifting. And it wasn't because they stopped loving each other. It was something much more complicated than that. Jelly Roll started talking in interviews about the pressure of being someone's everything. He'd mentioned how heavy it felt to be responsible for someone else's happiness when he was still learning how to handle his own. Those weren't random comments. Those were warnings. Those were a man trying to tell the world something was breaking inside him, but he didn't have the words yet. The pressure of redemption is real. When you're the story people point to and say, "See, people can change. People can get clean. People can make it," you become more than just a person. You become a symbol. You become proof. And symbols don't get to have bad days. They don't get to struggle. They don't get to admit that even after all the work, all the therapy, all the Grammy awards, some days they still feel like that kid in prison wondering if they'll ever actually be okay. Bunnie loved him, but she was also holding him to an impossible standard, not because she was cruel, but because she'd invested her own identity into being the woman who saved Jelly Roll. Their love had become codependent in a way neither of them saw coming. He was performing recovery instead of living it. Every time he went to therapy he was doing it partially for himself and partially to prove to Bunnie that he was still committed to being the man she believed in. Every time he stayed clean, and he did stay clean, part of him was doing it to earn her approval, not because it came from a genuine place inside him anymore. The relationship that started as his saving grace had become another prison. A nicer one. A prison made of love instead of bars. That's when he started to withdraw. He threw himself deeper into work. More tours. More studio time. More music. Because in the studio, he could be himself without having to be anyone's proof of anything. In the studio, his pain was just material. His struggle was just a song. He didn't have to perform recovery for anyone. Bunnie noticed. Of course she did. For months, maybe longer, Jelly Roll knew something was wrong. He could feel it in his chest every time he came home. He could feel it in the silence between conversations that used to flow naturally. He could feel it in the way Bunnie's eyes would search his face, looking for signs that he was still the man she'd married, still the man she'd saved. But he couldn't say it out loud. How do you tell someone you love that the thing they're most proud of, saving you, believing in you when nobody else did, has become the very thing that's suffocating you? How do you explain that their love, which was supposed to heal you, has actually kept you from doing the deeper work of healing yourself? That's not something you just say over dinner. That's a conversation that requires destroying everything you've built together, and Jelly Roll wasn't ready for that. So he stayed quiet. And quiet in a marriage is a slow death. It's the kind of death where everything looks fine from the outside but inside both people are drowning. Bunnie was drowning because she could sense him pulling away and didn't understand why. She'd done everything right. She'd been the perfect partner. She believed in him. So why was he leaving? Jelly Roll was drowning because he was living a lie that felt safer than the truth. He started spending more time away. More tour dates. More studio sessions that lasted until 3 in the morning. More reasons to not be home. And every time he left, he told himself it was temporary. That he just needed space. That things would get better. That if he just pushed a little harder, worked a little more, achieved a little more, somehow that would fix what was broken between them. It never did. The thing about trauma is that it doesn't just disappear because someone loves you. It doesn't get erased by success or money or a wedding ring. Jelly Roll was learning that the hard way. He could change his circumstances. He could change his address. He could change his career. But he couldn't change the fact that at his core, he still didn't believe he deserved to be happy. Not really. And you can't build a healthy marriage on a foundation of self-hatred, no matter how much the other person tries to convince you otherwise. That's what he finally understood. The public story is simple. Jelly Roll and Bunnie XO divorced. It happens. Celebrities break up all the time. People move on. But the real story, the one that matters, is about what actually happens when two people realize they've built something on a fantasy instead of reality. Bunnie wanted to save Jelly Roll. That was the foundation of their entire relationship. But Jelly Roll didn't want to be saved anymore. He wanted to save himself. Those are two completely different things and they're incompatible in a marriage. When you need someone to save you, you give them power over your life. You make them responsible for your sobriety, your mental health, your sense of worth. And when you finally realize that you're the only one who can actually do that work, you have to take that power back. But taking power back from someone who's invested years into being your savior? That's traumatic for everyone involved. Behind closed doors, there were probably conversations that never made it to social media. Therapy sessions where they both realized they'd fallen in love with an idea of each other instead of the real people they actually were. Nights where Jelly Roll tried to explain that he needed to be alone to figure out who he was without her. Nights where Bunnie cried because she felt like she was losing the man she'd fought so hard to keep. There were probably moments of anger. Moments of resentment. Moments where Bunnie felt used, like all her love and belief had been for nothing. Moments where Jelly Roll felt guilty for not being able to be the man she needed him to be. Because here's the truth that nobody talks about. You can love someone deeply and still not be right for them. You can be grateful for someone's role in your life and still need to leave them. Jelly Roll was learning that lesson in real time. He started therapy, but not the kind he did for Bunnie. The kind he did for himself. He started asking harder questions. Why did he feel guilty for wanting to be independent? Why did he feel like a failure for needing space? Why had he let someone else's belief in him become the only thing keeping him standing? These were the conversations that really mattered. These were the conversations that led to the divorce. Because sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is let them go so they can find out who they actually are without you. There wasn't one single moment where everything exploded. That's what people don't understand about breakups. They think there's always a dramatic fight, a betrayal, something concrete you can point to and say, that's when it ended. But for Jelly Roll and Bunnie, the end came quietly. It came in the spaces between words. It came in the things they stopped saying to each other. By 2024, Jelly Roll was a different man than the one who'd married Bunnie 2 years earlier. He'd gotten older. He'd done more therapy. He'd spent more time alone in the studio, which meant he'd spent more time with himself, the real self, not the performing self. And that version of him didn't need saving anymore. He'd done the work. He'd stayed clean. He'd built a career. He'd proven to himself that he could do these things not because someone believed in him, but because he believed in himself. That shift is subtle, but it's seismic. When you stop needing someone to save you, the dynamic of the entire relationship changes. Suddenly, all the things that made sense before, the constant reassurance, the need to prove your worth through achievement, the guilt when you wanted space, suddenly none of it makes sense anymore. You realize you've been performing in a play you didn't write, and the person you love is playing a part that no longer fits. Bunnie felt him leaving long before he actually left. She's talked about it in interviews since, how she could sense him pulling away, how she tried everything to bring him back. She loved him. That part was real. But love alone can't keep two people together when they're growing in opposite directions. She was looking for the man she'd saved. He was becoming a man who didn't need saving. The paparazzi started noticing things. They were seen less together. He was touring more. She was focused on her podcast empire. On social media, the couple content slowed down. Then it stopped. People started asking questions. Was everything okay? Were they having problems? They were, but they couldn't say it yet. Because admitting the truth meant admitting that maybe this love story wasn't actually a love story at all. Maybe it was two broken people who found each other at the exact right moment, and that moment had simply passed. Maybe redemption isn't something you can hand to someone else. Maybe it's something every person has to find on their own. That realization was the beginning of the end. When Jelly Roll finally spoke about the divorce publicly, he didn't make excuses. He didn't blame Bunnie. He didn't play the victim or paint himself as a martyr. Instead, he said something that most men in his position would never have the courage to say: I wasn't ready to be married. I wasn't ready to be the man she needed me to be. That's not the statement of someone running from responsibility. That's the statement of someone who's done the work and actually understands what went wrong. He explained that being with Bunnie had become another version of performing. Another way of trying to prove his worth through someone else's belief in him. He said that he needed to learn how to stand on his own 2 feet without needing external validation. Not from fans, not from awards, and not from a partner who loved him so completely that it became impossible to hear his own voice anymore. In interviews, he's been surprisingly honest about the specifics. He talked about how the pressure of being someone's everything had started to break him down mentally. How he'd wake up some mornings and feel suffocated by the weight of her expectations. Not because they were unreasonable, but because they existed at all. How the man she'd fallen in love with and the man he was becoming were two different people, and staying together would have eventually destroyed them both. He also said something crucial: she saved my life. That's real. I'll never take that away from her. But I had to learn to save myself too. That distinction matters. Because what Jelly Roll is saying is that Bunnie's love was real and necessary and important. She did help pull him out of the darkness. But at a certain point, you have to take responsibility for your own light. You have to stop looking to another person to be the reason you keep fighting. You have to become your own reason. That's the admission that shocked people because it wasn't bitter. It wasn't angry. It was just honest, raw. The kind of honesty that only comes when someone has actually done the internal work and isn't afraid of what people think anymore. He wasn't defending himself. He was explaining himself. And there's a huge difference. The hardest part of his admission came when he talked about the guilt. He felt guilty for needing space. He felt guilty for growing in a direction that took him away from her. He felt guilty for not being able to be the man she'd invested so much love into creating. That guilt had eaten him alive for months, maybe longer. And finally saying it out loud, finally admitting that he felt like he'd failed her, was the moment he actually started to heal. Because you can't move forward while you're carrying guilt. You can only move forward when you've named it, owned it, and decided that you're going to stop letting it control your choices. The story doesn't end with the divorce. In some ways, that's where the real story begins. Jelly Roll is at a place now where he's learning how to be in love with himself. That sounds like something a therapist would say, and it probably is. He's clearly been in therapy and doing the work. But it's also the most important thing he could be learning right now. Because if he can't love himself, genuinely and without conditions, then the next relationship he enters will just be a repeat of what happened with Bunnie. Different person, same broken foundation. He's still making music. He's still touring. He's still connected to Bunnie in the way that two people who shared something real will always be connected. But there's space now. Healthy space. The kind of space that allows both of them to figure out who they are without performing for each other anymore. Bunnie has moved forward too. She's continued building her podcast empire. She's been open about her own healing journey. And importantly, she's not vilified him in the process. She's acknowledged that sometimes two people can love each other completely and still not be right for each other. That's actually mature. That's actually what real love looks like at the end. What Jelly Roll's story teaches us is something that nobody really wants to hear. Redemption is lonely. Real change is lonely. When you're doing the deep work of becoming a better version of yourself, you can't rely on someone else to carry you through it. You have to carry yourself. And sometimes the people who love us most have to step back so we can do that work. The tragedy isn't that Jelly Roll and Bunnie's marriage ended. The tragedy would have been if they'd stayed together and slowly poisoned each other with resentment and guilt and the weight of impossible expectations. The fact that they both had the courage to let go, that they both chose truth over comfort, that's actually the redemption story. Jelly Roll went from prison to Grammy Awards. He went from addiction to sobriety. He went from a man nobody believed in to a man millions of people celebrate. But the final step of his redemption, the step that actually matters most, is learning to believe in himself. Not because someone else does. Not because he's proven it to the world. But because he's finally actually done the work to know it's true. That's what comes next. Not a new relationship. Not a new chapter with someone else. But a relationship with himself that's built on something real. Something honest. Something that can actually last. And that, in the end, is the only redemption that ever really matters.